Hospitals are supposed to be safe places where lives are saved, where suffering ends. But when the doors close for the last time, and the corridors are left to rot in silence, something else takes root in the darkness. Whispers echo through the halls, shadows drift past broken windows, and sometimes, the ones who never left still reach out from the other side. These are not just stories, they are true accounts of abandoned hospitals where the unexplained still lingers. Tonight, you'll step inside with me, if you dare. Welcome to Farcical Fears. Make sure you subscribe now, because once you hear these stories, you'll never walk past an empty hospital the same way again. Let's move to our first story. I never believed the stories about abandoned hospitals until I experienced one myself. And even now, as I write this, part of me wonders if I actually survived, or if I've been trapped there ever since, repeating the memory like a broken loop. Because what happened in the old St. Augustine's Children's Hospital can't be explained in any way that makes sense. The building had been closed since the late 1980s, after a fire gutted one of the wings. And rumors spread through town about shadows in the windows at night, laughter echoing down the street, and a strange red glow that sometimes pulsed from the operating ward even though the electricity had been cut decades ago. But I was young and arrogant and dared to step inside, telling myself I'd just take a few photos and prove everyone else was just superstitious. And yet as soon as I crossed the threshold, the air shifted. It was heavier, thicker, as though every breath was filtered through ash and dust. And the silence wasn't silence at all, but a deep, layered hum, like dozens of whispers buried beneath the stillness. The halls were endless, wallpaper peeling like shed skin, paint cracked into patterns resembling veins, and graffiti half-erased by time. But what unnerved me most wasn't the decayed, was the sensation that the hospital wasn't empty. That something had been waiting for me. As I wandered past a row of broken wheelchairs, one rolled forward on its own, slow, deliberate, the squeal of its rusted wheel echoing too loud in the narrow corridor. And I froze, because there was no slope, no draft, no reason for it to move. And yet it stopped just inches from me, as though it wanted me to sit. I didn't, of course, but the longer I stared at it, the more the seat seemed darker than shadow, like a hollow spot sucking the light away. I pressed on, forcing myself not to run, but the deeper I went, the stranger it became. Doors that should have been locked creaked open as I approached, revealing rooms where beds were made, with pristine white sheets, not dusty, not torn, not aged, as if the hospital still functioned inside some fractured pocket of time. In one room, a teddy bear sat upright on the pillow, its button eyes reflecting the dim light. And when I stepped closer, I swore its stitched mouth twitched upward in a smile, and I bolted, nearly tripping over my own feet. My heart beat thunderous. In my ears, I thought maybe I was hallucinating, maybe mold or asbestos was messing with my head, but then I heard it, a faint giggle, childlike, just behind me, and, when I turned, the hallway was empty, yet the echo of that laugh lingered, bouncing off the tiles until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Panic clawed at me, but I refused to be chased out, telling myself if I just reached the operating wing I'd get the proof I needed. So I pushed forward until I reached double doors, with glass windows smeared in something too dark and thick to be dust, and when I leaned closer, I realized it was handprints, small ones, hundreds of them, pressed into the glass from the inside, as though desperate children had clawed to escape, each print frozen in perfect clarity. Trembling, I pushed the door, and it groaned open, revealing an operating theater bathed in a faint red glow, the same glow locals claimed to see at night. And at the center stood an old operating table, rusted, but beneath the decay lay fresh straps buckled tight, as though someone had just been restrained. And next to it on a tray were tools, surgical scissors, scalpels, clamps, all polished, all gleaming, untouched by time. And when I looked up at the balcony where doctors once observed, I saw shadows standing shoulder to shoulder, faceless, but undeniable, their forms hazy yet solid enough to block the faint light behind them. I stumbled back, choking on terror, and the shadows moved in unison, leaning forward as though watching me with hungry intent. And that was when I heard the intercom click on, though no power should have been running, and a distorted voice crackled through. Dr. 2OR. Dr. 2OR. Repeating over and over, mechanical and wrong, yet layered with something underneath, almost like a growl, and the red glow brightened until it washed over the room like blood. I fled, sprinting through corridors that seemed to twist and loop. No exit in sight, doors slamming shut before I could reach them, walls groaning like the building itself was alive, until at last I found the lobby again, but it wasn't as I'd left it. For the exit doors were gone, replaced by more hallways stretching into blackness. And in the center of the lobby now stood that same wheelchair, waiting, its seat darker than ever, and behind it stood a figure, a tall, thin man in a doctor's coat, his face obscured by a surgical mask. But his eyes gleamed like polished glass, reflecting the faint light. And in his hand he held a clipboard stained with something brown, dripping steadily to the floor. He raised a gloved finger to his mask, silencing me before I could even scream, and in that silence came the sound of dozens of footsteps. Children's feet padding across tile, surrounding me, though nothing visible moved, and the air grew icy, my breath forming fog as I stumbled back, whispering that I didn't mean to intrude, that I was leaving. But the doctor only tilted his head and stepped aside, gesturing toward the wheelchair. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, my mind screaming to run, while my body felt anchored, drawn toward that abyssal seat, until the lights flickered and every shadow in the room surged forward at once, and the next thing I remember, I was outside, lying in the weeds by the front gate, my camera smashed beside me. The footage corrupted beyond recovery, but carved into my forearm were small handprints, faint but real, as if dozens of children had clutched me in desperation, refusing to let me go. Weeks later, the marks still haven't faded, and at night, when I try to sleep, I hear that same intercom crackle on in the darkness of my room. Dr. 2OR. Dr. 2OR. Growing louder until it drowns out every other thought, and I know, deep down, that someday soon, I'll wake up not in my bed, but back on that table, straps tightening, shadows watching, and this time, I won't escape. Let's move to our second story. I never thought curiosity could be so dangerous, until I found myself wandering through the abandoned St. Mercer's Hospital, a place locals whispered about, but few ever dared enter, a hospital that had been left to rot for decades after a mysterious fire consumed the East Wing and claimed the lives of several patients, whose names were scratched off every record, leaving only rumors and half-remembered whispers. But I was young, hungry for the thrill of discovery, and eager to prove to myself that fear is just the mind playing tricks. So I slipped through a broken window one late afternoon, thinking I'd take a few photos, maybe record a short exploration video, and leave before sunset. Yet the moment my foot crossed the threshold, the air thickened, a stale, almost metallic scent of decay and antiseptic lingering, and I immediately felt eyes on me, not physical eyes, but the heavy, suffocating gaze of something that had been waiting, silent, patient, and ancient. The halls were a labyrinth of peeling paint and shattered tiles, the fluorescent lights long dead, yet shadows seemed to shift of their own accord, curling around corners like living smoke. And with every step, the floor groaned beneath me as if the building itself were alive, responding to my intrusion, and then I heard it. A faint dragging sound behind me, irregular, uneven, yet too deliberate to be the wind, and I paused, heart hammering, convinced it was my imagination, but the sound repeated, closer, accompanied by the faintest whisper, "Help me, help me," so soft I almost dismissed it, except it seemed to echo in every direction, bouncing off the walls, wrapping around me. And I realized in that instant that this place had not been abandoned in the way most buildings are, empty and inert, but had instead been left to harbor something, to hold on to memories, to trap the residual energy of pain, fear, and suffering. Because as I ventured deeper into the corridors, I began to see things that should not exist, doors that weren't there before, windows that led into darkness instead of the courtyard, and long-forgotten patient rooms where beds were neatly made, as if someone had just vacated them. The sheets unnaturally white against the decay, and in the center of one room stood a small chair rocking back and forth, empty, yet moving with a rhythm that was impossible to ignore, and when I approached, a cold hand seemed to brush my shoulder, though no one was there. and my own reflection in a cracked mirror behind the bed showed my expression twisted in fear. Yet the image was slightly off, my eyes darker, almost hollow, staring back at me with an intensity that made me stagger. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself my mind was playing tricks. But rationality collapsed when I entered the old surgical ward, the room still smelling faintly of antiseptic and burned chemicals. Surgical tables rusted and pocked, yet arranged meticulously, as though ready for use, and on one table lay a small, worn doll. Charred at the edges, but unmistakably human in shape, its head turned toward me, eyes wide, and I could swear it smiled. That stitched mouth twitching as I backed away, and then the whispers became louder, joined by faint footsteps pacing in the distance, not random, not aimless, but organized, synchronized almost, echoing through the empty halls like some malevolent ritual, and the lights, which I hadn't noticed before, flickered sporadically, red and blue hues pulsing over walls that shouldn't have existed, corners folding in strange angles that made the architecture feel impossible, as though the hospital had become a labyrinth designed to trap me, to disorient, and I felt my stomach churn as nausea set in. Yet something compelled me to keep moving forward, to understand, to witness, and I found myself in a long, narrow corridor, lined with doors on either side, each door slightly ajar, and from behind them I could hear faint cries, whispering voices, the rustle of movement, and each time I opened one, the room appeared empty, dust motes floating in beams of light that weren't really there. And then one door slammed shut violently behind me, leaving me in darkness, and my flashlight flickered, leaving me blind, only to reveal when it stuttered back to life, a shadowy figure standing at the far end of the hall, taller than any human should be, faceless, dressed in a tattered nurse's uniform, and as it moved closer, gliding rather than walking, the cries became coherent. "Leave. You don't belong. Leave." And panic surged through me as I ran blindly, turning corners that led me back to the same hallway over and over. Doors now closed that I hadn't noticed before, and the ceiling above groaning and sagging like it might collapse, dust and debris falling around me, making it impossible to see clearly. Yet I could feel the figure following, its presence heavy and pressing, whispering directly into my mind, repeating my name. A distorted version of my own voice, twisting my thoughts, eroding my sanity, until I stumbled into a patient ward filled with rows of beds, each occupied by indistinct forms under sheets, the shapes shifting, stretching as if alive, heads rising slightly to look at me, and I realized these were the remnants, echoes, or spirits of patients who had died, left behind by neglect, fire, or something far worse. And they didn't want me there. I screamed, tried to push through, but invisible hands gripped my arms, pulling me back toward the center of the ward, where a large operating table stood, instruments glinting in the unnatural red glow above, and on it lay an indistinct, writhing mass, like a combination of charred human remains and some living, breathing entity, pulsing and wriggling as though aware, alive, and aware of me. And I realized in horror that the hospital wasn't just haunted, it was feeding, sustaining itself, on fear, on attention, on intrusion, and I had become the target. I struggled, and somehow broke free, running down corridors that twisted and folded like the architecture itself was a living trap. The whispers growing louder, chanting, screaming, sometimes human, sometimes not, shadows lashing at me as I moved, until I found a stairwell that led upward, and for a brief, terrifying moment I saw the exit doors ahead bathed in sunlight, normal, mundane, as though mocking the nightmare I had just endured. Yet the moment I reached them, they dissolved into darkness, replaced by more hallways, more rooms filled with cries, shadows, an impossible architecture, and I knew then that I wasn't escaping, that the hospital had claimed me in some way, bending reality, twisting perception, and I could feel the malevolent intelligence guiding the building itself, learning my movements, anticipating my thoughts, and as exhaustion and terror overtook me, I collapsed into a corner, hearing the footsteps converge, the whispers surrounding me, the cold hands pressing my shoulders and back into the floor. And I realized that the hospital didn't just haunt the living, it integrated them, absorbed them into the endless cycle, adding their fear, their presence, to the weight that would trap the next person who dared enter. And in those final moments of clarity, I understood that my survival was a lie. That the outside world, the light, the air, and reality itself were no longer connected to me. And as the shadows closed in, the red glow pulsing brighter, the whispers chanting in unison, I screamed once. And then the building swallowed me completely, leaving nothing but silence, dust, and an impossible story that would remain true for anyone else brave or foolish enough to enter St. Mercer's abandoned hospital. Let's move to our third story. I had always heard rumors about the Eastwood Memorial Hospital, a crumbling, forgotten building on the outskirts of town. A place children once called cursed, and adults dismissed as superstition, but curiosity and a sense of invincibility had always driven me to explore the forbidden. So I found myself stepping through its rotting front doors one late evening, the air thick with dust, mildew, and something far fouler I couldn't identify, a heavy, oppressive sensation that pressed against my chest as I advanced into the main hallway, where the flickering light from my weak flashlight barely pierced the shadows. And the silence was not empty, but alive, humming faintly, almost as if the building itself was breathing, aware of my presence, waiting to interact with me in ways I couldn't yet understand. And almost immediately I noticed that the hallway seemed impossibly long, twisting back on itself, as if space had been manipulated, and the rooms lining it held the residue of life that had long since been abandoned. In one room, a child's wheelchair sat upright, wheels rusted but pristine in appearance, as though freshly placed. And as I approached, it squeaked softly, moving forward on its own, my heart leaping into my throat. Yet when I spun around, there was no one, no sign of life, and yet the feeling of being watched intensified, prickling my skin. I pressed on, entering what had once been the pediatric ward, where beds still had sheets folded neatly, toys abandoned in corners, tiny shoes lined up, as if waiting for children who would never return. And it was here that I first heard the whispers, soft and indistinct, growing louder in a rhythmic cadence. Voices layering over each other, crying, laughing, pleading, and I could swear they were calling my name, coaxing me further into the bowels of the hospital, deeper than I had intended to go. But the sensation of being drawn, compelled, was irresistible and terrifying, as though an invisible hand was guiding me. I entered the surgical wing, where the air grew colder, heavy with a metallic scent of something long decomposed, and the tables, though covered in dust, seemed arranged in preparation. Instruments lying gleaming in the dim light, as if freshly sterilized, and at the center of the room lay a gurney with leather straps, tightened as if holding an invisible patient. And the walls seemed to pulse faintly, veins of mold and decay shifting subtly, like the hospital itself was alive, feeding on fear and attention. And as I leaned closer to examine the gurney, I felt it move beneath me slightly, a pressure that was impossible to explain. And the whispers crescendoed into a chorus of pleading voices, crying out from every corner, overlapping in a cacophony of despair. I backed away, stumbling into the hallway, where the fluorescent lights flickered violently, casting shadows that didn't align with reality, some stretching across walls at impossible angles, others appearing detached from any object. And in the center of the corridor, a shadowy figure manifested, tall, slender, faceless, wearing a tattered nursed uniform, and it didn't move in a human manner, gliding, flowing. And yet every step it took resonated with authority, commanding the air around it, and I froze, heart pounding, unable to look away, as it gestured toward a side room, beckoning me, and I knew, instinctively, that whatever awaited inside was beyond comprehension. But the pull was too strong. Curiosity and terror intertwined, and I obeyed, stepping into the room to find it lined with rows of small beds, each occupied by indistinct, shadowy forms. Children frozen mid-motion, their faces blurred, yet somehow expressive, showing fear, sorrow, and anger simultaneously. And the walls themselves seemed to close in, pressing toward me, making every breath shallow. Yet the figure at the door remained, observing, patient. As I tried to retreat, the door slammed shut on its own, and I was plunged into near-total darkness, the whispers now screaming, overlapping voices in a maddening pattern, echoing off walls that had expanded impossibly, twisting the room into a space that defied geometry. And then I saw them, the faceless children rising slightly from their beds, limbs stretching in ways no human body should bend, eyes glowing faintly red as they advanced toward me, and a sense of inevitable doom washed over me, cold and heavy, pressing into my chest as if the hospital itself had weight. And I realized that this was not merely haunting, not merely residual energy, but a conscious entity, one that thrived on fear, on intrusion, on the act of watching, participating. And I had become part of it, feeding the intelligence that had grown from decades of abandonment and suffering. I stumbled backward, tripping over a chair, and in the dim light, I caught sight of the figure from the corridor now standing behind me. Elongated fingers brushing the walls, a distorted silhouette, faceless, yet somehow knowing, and a cold, unnatural wind seemed to issue from its form, carrying the smell of decay and something acidic, burning my nostrils, and as I scrambled to my feet, the walls began to ripple, as though liquid, moving toward me with intent, narrowing the corridor into a funnel. And the shadows of the children reached out, elongated hands, impossibly long, grasping at my limbs, trying to pull me into the room, their whispers turning into agonized screams, piercing my mind, eroding my sense of self, while the faceless nurse figure glided closer. The red glow of unseen lights illuminating its form, pulsating rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat, sinking, with the terror surging through me, and I realized that every step, every motion, every breath I took was being observed, recorded, consumed by the building, and there was no escape. I ran blindly down the twisted corridors, doors appearing and disappearing, stairwells folding into each other, the layout impossible and surreal, yet hyper-realistic, as though the hospital was reshaping itself to trap me, to isolate me further. And every so often I glimpsed fleeting figures in the corner of my vision. Children and adults alike, twisted, distorted, caught in moments of past trauma, replaying endlessly, their faces pleading silently for help or warning me. I couldn't tell which, and I realized that those who had entered before had become part of this web, consumed, preserved, feeding the malevolent presence, and my mind struggled to hold on to reality. But the whispers and shadows never ceased, always following, always observing. As I eventually stumbled into the main lobby, thinking the exit would finally appear, only to find it replaced with another hallway, doors that led nowhere, and at the center, a wheelchair waiting, seat unnaturally black as void. The faceless figure gesturing toward it, commanding, and as I approached, faintly resisting, I felt invisible hands grip my shoulders, pulling me back, whispering in voices I recognized as my own, twisting my memories, and the red glow from above intensified, bathing the walls in unnatural light, pulsating as if alive. And I understood in that moment that the hospital didn't just haunt it, integrated, absorbed, and repurposed those who entered, adding them to the energy sustaining the building. And no matter how I struggled, screamed, or pleaded, I felt the invisible tether drawing me toward the central gurney, where instruments gleamed, straps tightening, and shadows pressed closer, enveloping me in a final, all-consuming embrace, until everything faded into the pulsing red, the whispers, the shadows, the weight of decades of fear, and I was no longer outside the building. I was inside, part of the hospital's consciousness, and perhaps now I, too, wait for the next intruder, trapped in a cycle of horror that has no end. Let's move to our fourth story. The abandoned Whitmore Psychiatric Hospital had always loomed like a dark omen on the outskirts of my hometown. Its crumbling facade, a warning that no one truly listened to until I decided, fueled by a mix of reckless curiosity and a desire for proof, to step inside and document what remained of its forgotten horrors. And from the very first step across the threshold, the atmosphere clamped around me like iron, cold, heavy, and dense with despair. A suffocating air that smelled of mildew, rot, and something metallic, sharp, and tangibly wrong. As though the building itself had absorbed decades of human suffering, and chosen this night, this moment, to make its presence known. And as I walked down the main corridor, the peeling paint and warped tiles seemed alive, curling subtly at the edges, as if reaching for me. And the distant sound of a rhythmic tapping echoed through the halls, inconsistent but deliberate, like someone or something measuring my intrusion, and it grew louder with every step, reverberating against the walls in a pattern that teased both logic and primal fear. Until I finally realized it wasn't just a sound, but a voice, faint, childlike, repeating a single, chilling word over and over. Leave, 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 whispered simultaneously from every corner. Each repetition layered over the last, until it was impossible to distinguish where it came from. And yet the sensation wasn't merely auditory, because the walls themselves seemed to vibrate, pulses running along the mold-streaked plaster, as if the building's heartbeat were syncing with mine, driving my panic higher. And I knew immediately that this place had been left to rot not because it was empty, but because it had grown conscious of its environment, sensitive to the emotions and intentions of those who dared enter, and I could feel its anticipation, a malevolent intelligence that both watched and waited for me to break, to succumb. And as I turned into the wing that had housed the most violent patients, the air shifted again, becoming heavier, more pungent, and the faint glow of the failing overhead lights revealed subtle, almost imperceptible movement in the shadows, shapes that twisted at impossible angles, corners folding in ways no human mind should register. And yet my body couldn't stop moving forward, compelled by morbid curiosity and the inexorable feeling that if I didn't, I would be consumed anyway. The rooms themselves were worse, each one a microcosm of terror. Beds, still made in geometric precision, medical equipment scattered but seemingly in use. And I could swear I saw the faint outline of someone sitting at the foot of a bed, hunched, shaking, faceless, yet screaming silently, vanishing as soon as my light fell upon it, leaving only the impression of despair. And in another, a small journal lay open on a table, pages smeared with something dark and sticky, yet the ink seemed fresh, writing that shifted when I blinked. Phrases like "we see you and you belong," forming and reforming, unreadable, yet unmistakably directed at me. The whispers intensified, now a chorus of human voices, old and young, male and female, overlapping in a symphony of anguish that pressed against my skull, until I stumbled backward into the central hallway, where the ceiling had sagged ominously, cracks snaking across its surface, like the veins of some gigantic, unseen creature, and from these fissures, thin, pale hands reached down, wriggling and grasping at me with unnatural speed, and when I tried to run, the floor beneath me warped, stretching longer, turning the hallway into a never-ending corridor, forcing me forward, deeper into the building's trap. At the end, a door stood partially open, emanating a soft, red glow, and I knew instinctively that it led to the heart of the hospital's consciousness, the epicenter of its power, and as I stepped closer, the temperature dropped, frost forming on my clothing, breath misting in unnatural puffs, and through the dim red light, I saw figures moving in slow, synchronized motion, patients from decades ago, some burned, some emaciated, all faceless, their arms outstretched, as if performing some ritual I couldn't comprehend. And the door clicked behind me, slamming shut, sealing me inside, and the whispers became a scream, high-pitched and tearing through my mind. Voices merging, overlapping, screaming for release, for vengeance, for companionship, for me. The walls began to pulse, breathing in and out, expanding and contracting in time with the screaming. And I saw the floor beneath me ripple like liquid, hands of the dead emerging, pale and wet, grasping at my feet, ankles, trying to pull me down. And yet something compelled me to look up, to see what awaited in the center of the room, where an operating table rested. Rusted, yet gleaming under the red glow, straps tightened as if freshly used, and upon it lay a figure, swaying, faceless, body contorted in ways impossible, skin stretched unnaturally, and a mask of surgical equipment partially fused to its head. And I realized in terror that this wasn't a body, not exactly, but some amalgamation, a creation of the building birthed from fear, pain, and twisted intent. I tried to turn and run, but the walls had closed in. The corridor had vanished, leaving only the room and its horrific occupant. And then from the ceiling, hundreds of hands dropped, pale and skeletal, scraping against the walls and floor, pushing, pulling, hurting me toward the table. And the faceless patient's head turned slightly toward me, revealing an eye in the center of its forehead, glowing faintly red, tracking my every movement. And in that instant I understood that I was part of an experiment, part of a living nightmare that had evolved over decades, absorbing each visitor into its consciousness, adding to its power, and the whispering chorus transformed into voices. I recognized memories of previous explorers, intruders, and victims, all chanting, all screaming, all warning me, yet powerless against the weight of the building. I fell to my knees, my mind fracturing under the relentless sensory assault, the hands dragging me inch by inch toward the table, the glowing eye staring into me, and the red light intensified until it felt like it was burning my very soul, pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat, syncing me with the building itself, and I realized there was no escape, no outside world. Only the hospital and its endless hunger, a conscious entity feeding off curiosity, fear, and life. And as my consciousness began to fragment, I felt my body lifted, strapped to the table, the amalgamated figure leaning closer, and the hands pressing against me from all sides, whispering my name, claiming me. And in that final moment of awareness, I understood that Whitmore Psychiatric Hospital didn't just haunt the living, it consumed them, absorbed them into its twisted ecosystem, adding them to the chorus that would torment the next intruder. And as darkness overtook me completely, I became part of it, a whisper in the walls, a shadow in the corner, waiting for the next curious soul to step inside and feed the building's unending hunger. Let's move to our fifth story. Hollow Creek Sanitarium had been abandoned for decades, yet its reputation had only grown darker with time. Whispered tales of patients vanishing, doctors behaving erratically, and unexplained screams echoing through the woods surrounding it. But I, compelled by a reckless mix of curiosity and arrogance, decided one stormy night to step inside. Flashlight in hand and camera, recording every step, convinced that I would uncover nothing but decay and urban legend. And yet the moment I crossed the threshold, the air itself seemed to thicken, cold and heavy with the scent of mold, rot, and something faintly sweet and coppery, a smell that clung to my skin and hair. And I realized immediately that this place was different, alive in ways I could neither explain nor anticipate, the walls themselves humming with an undercurrent of energy that set my nerves on edge. The main hallway stretched before me, warped and impossibly long, doors on either side slightly ajar, each revealing glimpses of the past. Beds with sheets folded meticulously, old medical charts scattered as if dropped in a hurry, and shadows that didn't correspond to the architecture stretching along the walls, moving independently, and I could hear whispers, faint at first, but growing steadily louder, chanting, crying, sometimes laughter, sometimes moans, voices layered atop each other in a way that made my head spin, and when I tried to leave, the hallways seemed to elongate endlessly, corners folding back on themselves, turning the exit into another corridor leading deeper into the building. As I moved forward, I entered the old therapy wing, where the floors were warped and sticky with residue I couldn't identify. And therapy rooms appeared frozen in time, chairs arranged in circles, journals and toys scattered, and the faint sound of piano music, dissonant and slow, emanated from nowhere, filling the room and causing the hairs on my neck to rise. And then I saw movement, a small figure crouched in the corner, its face obscured by hair, rocking slowly, whispering my name, beckoning me closer. And the longer I looked, the more figures appeared, hundreds of them, fleeting, shadowy, overlapping each other, some crying silently, some laughing in distorted tones, and I realized that this wasn't just a haunting. It was a congregation, a gathering of lost souls, trapped, absorbed into the consciousness of the building over decades, and their presence was palpable, pressing down on me physically, emotionally, mentally. I tried to back away, but the door I had entered through was gone, replaced by another hallway stretching impossibly in both directions, lined with rooms whose interiors shifted when I glanced away, beds with faceless patients, dolls and toys, moving on their own, and in the center of the hallway, a wheelchair spun slowly, unoccupied, yet moving as if guiding me, directing me toward the heart of the building, and I understood that it was alive, aware, sentient, feeding on attention, on intrusion, on the very act of being observed. As I followed, the whispering crescendoed into screams, and the walls seemed to pulse and breathe, cracking and bleeding shadows that twisted toward me, reaching, grasping, pulling at my clothing and skin. And in one room, I saw a surgical table, rusted straps pulled tight as though restraining a patient, and upon it lay a writhing form, a grotesque amalgamation of charred flesh, skeletal remains, and something else that moved with unnatural intelligence, and its head rotated slowly toward me, faceless yet somehow intelligent. And I understood with visceral certainty that the building had created it, a guardian or predator sustained by fear. Panic overwhelmed me, and I ran blindly. The corridors bending and folding impossibly, doors appearing and disappearing, stairs leading to nowhere, and shadows following, whispering, chanting, always closing in, until I stumbled into a grand atrium, its ceiling caved in, exposing a stormy sky above, rain leaking through, mixing with the dust and decay on the floor, and there, in the center, dozens of shadowy figures emerged from the walls, faceless, elongated limbs, some gliding, others crawling, all moving toward me with purpose, and I realized in horror that there was no escape, that the building itself had claimed me as part of its ecosystem, feeding on fear, adding me to the chorus of voices that had welcomed me unknowingly. And as I tried to scream, the walls seemed to close, hands reaching from every direction, faces emerging from plaster and shadows, whispering my name, echoing my thoughts back to me, twisting my perception of reality, and the last thing I felt was the grip of unseen forces lifting me toward the central table, straps tightening, the amalgamated figure looming over me, the red glow of some unseen light pulsating across the room, syncing with my own heartbeat. And I understood finally that Hollow Creek Sanitarium didn't just haunt. It absorbed, it preserved, it multiplied, and I had become part of its living nightmare, a whisper in the walls, a shadow in the corridors, waiting for the next foolhardy soul to enter and feed the cycle. And as consciousness slipped, the building thrummed with satisfaction, alive, eternal, and hungry. Its dark hunger satisfied by curiosity and terror, and I became one more story whispered among many, a caution, unheeded by the next brave or foolish intruder. Let's move to our sixth story. Blackwood Asylum had always been the subject of hushed conversations and local legends, a place where the most disturbed patients were sent, and where whispers of cruel experiments and unexplained disappearances persisted long after its doors were shuttered, and it was precisely these dark rumors that drew me to the crumbling building one cold, fog-laden night, flashlight in hand and a recorder running, thinking I would capture the eerie atmosphere for evidence. Yet the instant I stepped into the rot-infested lobby, the air struck me with a weight that made every breath a struggle, thick with the smell of mildew, decay, and something faintly metallic that reminded me of old blood. And the shadows seemed to ripple unnaturally along the walls, twisting at impossible angles, the ceiling above sagging with age, as if it were alive and observing my every move. And the silence, though overwhelming, was punctuated by distant, distorted whispers, faint and unintelligible at first, but growing steadily louder as if reacting to my presence. A chorus of voices layering over each other, crying, laughing, and pleading in a rhythmic pattern that caused my pulse to spike, and as I advanced through the main corridor, I noticed the walls themselves seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting subtly, molding the space into shapes that defied logic. Hallways elongating and twisting in ways my mind refused to process, and each door I passed offered glimpses of the past, therapy rooms frozen in time, beds neatly made, rusted instruments on trays, journals and toys scattered across floors, and in one room, a single wheelchair spun slowly, unoccupied, yet moving, with a malevolent intent, drawing me toward it, and as I followed, the whispers coalesced into phrases I could understand, beckoning me deeper, promising secrets, if only I would comply. And I realized then that this building was sentient, aware of me, feeding on my fear and curiosity, shaping its architecture, its environment, and its spectral inhabitants, to entrap me, to pull me deeper into the heart of its darkness. And as I stumbled into the patient wards, the air grew colder, frost forming along my clothing, breath misting invisible clouds, and I saw them figures crouched in corners, faceless, elongated, their movements unnatural, almost as though they were stretching and folding themselves to fit the warped space, whispering my name, urging me forward while a growing sense of dread pressed down on my chest, an invisible weight tethering me to the building, making every motion laborious, my heartbeat syncing with the building's pulsing rhythm. And in the therapy wing, I found the remnants of abandoned sessions, journals detailing bizarre rituals and forbidden practices, some smeared with dark substances that I dared not identify, toys arranged in patterns that suggested a ritualistic purpose, and a faint, dissonant music played from nowhere, keys striking at impossible intervals, echoing through the halls, filling the space with a slow, nauseating rhythm that seemed to dictate my pace, compelling me forward despite every instinct screaming to flee. I turned a corner into the old surgical wing, where tables were lined meticulously, rusted tools gleaming faintly in the red glow that now suffused the air. Straps tightened as if restraining invisible patients, and shadows moved independently along walls, dancing and twisting with their own intent, while from the ceiling, skeletal hands dropped, reaching toward me with unnatural speed, grasping, pulling, and the whispers turned to screams. Overlapping voices of past victims, doctors, and children, all trapped, all consumed, all warning me, yet powerless to stop the building's will. I stumbled into the main atrium, where the ceiling had caved in and rain poured through the opening, mixing with dust and decay. And at its center, a single table rested, rusted yet gleaming, surrounded by faceless figures, patients from decades past, their bodies contorted, limbs elongated, faces missing, yet expressive in a way that filled me with a bone-deep terror. And as I approached, an unseen force lifted me, straps tightening around my wrists and ankles, and I felt the building's consciousness pressing against me, probing, testing, claiming, while the amalgamated faceless forms on the table twisted toward me, glowing eyes forming in places they should not, watching, understanding, communicating, without words. And in that moment, I knew that the asylum did not simply haunt or scare, it consumed, integrated, absorbed, preserving its victims within its ever-expanding consciousness. And as I struggled, I felt myself being drawn in, my mind fracturing under the pressure, the walls bending, the floor warping, hands from the shadows clutching at me, whispering my fears back to me, twisting reality into an endless nightmare. And the red glow intensified, syncing with my heartbeat, until all sensation became the building, all thought became its thought, all fear became fuel. And I understood in the last fragment of awareness that I was now part of Blackwood Asylum, my presence added to the chorus of lost souls, forever feeding the entity that had claimed me, waiting in silent anticipation for the next intruder, brave, or foolish enough to cross the threshold, to enter its halls, and feed its insatiable hunger for terror, curiosity, and life itself. Let's move to our seventh story. The abandoned corridors of Ravenshade Hospital had long been whispered about in the nearby town, a place so notorious for its unexplained disappearances that even police officers avoided the perimeter at night. Yet I found myself drawn to the building, flashlight in hand and recorder running, eager to document the infamous Patient Zero phenomena that local legends claimed still haunted the halls. And the moment I stepped inside, I felt a presence, thick and suffocating, pressing against my chest like the building itself was alive, breathing, and aware of me. The walls groaning under their own weight, while the ceiling sagged, in impossible angles, and shadows flickered, as if the very light I carried was being swallowed by unseen hands. My footsteps echoing unnaturally long, as though the building was warping time and space to keep me inside. And as I moved down the first hallway, the whispers began, soft and insistent, voices of past patients blending together in a chorus of pain and confusion, calling names I didn't recognize, but felt a terrifying familiarity with. And the air was cold, icy, carrying the faint scent of rust, old medicine, and decay, making every breath taste metallic and heavy. And I noticed the walls were covered with writings, scratched deep into the plaster, messages like "Don't trust him, he sees everything," and "We're still here," each letter trembling, as if alive, pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. And as I turned a corner, I entered what had once been the experimental wing, where old therapy rooms were frozen in time, beds still made, instruments laid out on trays. Yet the instruments were moving subtly, spinning and vibrating without any touch, and in the shadows, faceless figures crouched, watching me with intent, the sound of their breathing growing louder, synchronized with the pounding of my own heart. and I realized that the stories of Patient Zero were not just rumor. This entity was real. A malevolent consciousness that had somehow survived the closure of the hospital, feeding on the fear of those who entered, and I felt a tug at my mind, as though invisible hands were probing my thoughts, twisting memories, and implanting visions of the hospital's gruesome past. Patients screaming in restraints, doctors performing experiments in red-lit rooms, children disappearing from wards, with no trace, their faint cries echoing eternally through the building's walls. And the further I walked, the more distorted reality became, hallways folding in on themselves, doors opening to spaces that shouldn't exist, staircases descending infinitely. Yet I was compelled to follow, as if the hospital demanded it. And when I reached the central atrium, I was confronted by a mass of faceless patients, huddled together, limbs elongated and twisting, moving as a single entity, their whispers now a deafening roar, and the red light from the ceiling pulsed, in rhythm with their collective heartbeat, sending waves of nausea and terror through me. And one of them stepped forward, faceless yet somehow aware of my deepest fears, stretching impossibly toward me, and I felt my body freeze, unable to move, my mind screaming for escape, while my legs remained rooted to the water-stained floor. And as it touched me, visions of all who had entered Ravenshade before flickered in my consciousness. Lives erased, memories consumed, their faces merging into an endless void. And the whispers formed words that I could finally understand, repeating in unison, "You belong to us." And at that moment, I understood the hospital's cruel truth. Ravenshade did not simply house patients. It captured their souls, feeding its entity with fear, obedience, and despair. Each person absorbed into its consciousness, becoming a part of the faceless collective that haunted its halls. And as I tried to scream, my voice was swallowed, leaving only the sound of my own heartbeat, which now beat in sync with the pulsing red lights and the collective entity surrounding me. And I felt the last fragments of my individuality slipping away, merging with the dark consciousness that had claimed me. And as the shadows of Patient Zero enveloped me completely, I realized I would never leave Ravenshade. My presence now, another whisper in its chorus, waiting for the next intruder to enter. And the building exhaled a soundless, oppressive satisfaction, the echoes of its previous victims blending seamlessly with mine. And outside, the fog thickened, hiding the building from the world, preserving its horrors, silently biding its time, until curiosity, or foolishness, brought the next soul into its grasp. And in that endless, suffocating darkness, I became a part of Ravenshade itself, a faceless echo, whispering warnings to no one, trapped in the eternal nightmare of a place that consumed not just bodies, but minds and identities, an unending horror that existed beyond logic, beyond escape, a living entity fueled by terror. And as I faded, I felt the walls pulse one final time, the building breathing, watching, knowing, satisfied that another chapter had been written in its dark, eternal history. Let's move to our 8th story. The moment I stepped into the shadowed halls of Blackamoor Sanitarium, I felt as though the very air had weight, thick with the despair and suffering of decades, a stench of mold and antiseptic lingering faintly. And as my flashlight beam cut through the darkness, I saw the peeling wallpaper of the main corridor twisting like it was alive, shifting subtly in rhythm with a pulse I could feel in my chest. And the further I walked, the more the building seemed to observe me, the shadows crawling unnaturally along walls, forming grotesque shapes that mimicked human movement, yet distorted in impossible ways. And I came upon the old psychiatric ward, where rusted beds lined the walls, restraints hanging loosely from their posts. Yet, as I approached, I noticed some beds were occupied by faceless figures, crouched and rocking silently, their whispers blending into a low hum that vibrated in my ears and penetrated my thoughts. And I could feel them studying me, probing my mind, reminding me of the stories I had heard, of the so-called silent patients who never left. And the stories were true. Their presence was alive, aware, and malevolent. A consciousness formed from the anguish and fear of those who had been experimented on in this forsaken place. And the deeper I ventured into Blackamoor, the more reality itself began to warp, corridors bending impossibly, doors leading into spaces that should not exist, ceilings lowering and rising unpredictably, as if the building itself were breathing, shaping the environment to trap me. And in one room, I found journals filled with frantic handwriting, some pages detailing treatments so cruel they defied belief, notes on patients who vanished, and the occasional message, scratched into the margins in trembling letters, warning the next visitor, don't look behind the mirror, don't follow the sound, don't leave. And yet, I could not resist, drawn forward by a combination of fear, fascination, and a compulsion I did not understand, and as I passed a cracked mirror, my reflection vanished, replaced by a faceless version of myself, reaching out with distorted limbs, and the whispers intensified, now a cacophony of voices shouting my name, recounting every secret fear I had ever held. And I realized that Blackmore did not simply hold ghosts, it absorbed identity, consuming the minds of those who wandered too far into its halls, incorporating them into its endless echo of despair. And in the surgical wing, the instruments moved as though handled by invisible hands, gleaming under a faint red glow, rusted and sharp, suspended above tables, while shadows on the walls twisted and lengthened, forming the shapes of the very patients who had disappeared. Their bodies and faces distorted, elongated, unrecognizable, yet somehow sentient, watching, waiting, assessing, and I felt an icy grip on my spine as if unseen fingers pressed into my shoulders, urging me to join them, to surrender, and I could hear footsteps behind me, though when I turned, the corridor was empty, yet the sound persisted, echoing unnaturally. Unbound by physical space, a sound that was not just auditory but tactile, vibrating through my bones, and as I continued, I entered the flooded atrium. Water pooling over the cracked tiles, reflections distorted by ripples, revealing dozens of faceless patients standing silently beneath the surface, their presence both horrifying and hypnotic, their whispers now forming coherent words. You will stay, you will join us, you will never leave. And panic surged as I attempted to retreat, but the corridors had shifted, leading me deeper into the building, looping endlessly, a labyrinth designed to trap, torment, and consume. And in the grand therapy hall, I saw them, the silent patients, faceless yet fully aware, moving in a synchronized rhythm, shadows merging with the walls and ceiling, and their presence seemed to extend into my very mind, erasing memories, implanting visions of my own fear, forcing me to relive moments of terror from my past, amplifying every anxiety, every insecurity, until I felt hollowed, emptied, consumed. And I realized that Blackamore's power was not just supernatural, but psychological, feeding on the mind, fear manifesting into tangible forms. And as I staggered through another corridor, the walls themselves seemed to breathe, pulsating with a dark red light, casting grotesque shadows that reached for me, and every doorway I approached opened onto impossible vistas, endless stairwells descending into voids, rooms filled with distorted mannequins resembling former patients, and ceilings dripping with water that reflected images of faceless, amalgamated figures, their eyes glowing faintly as they watched me, calculating, patient. And as the panic reached its peak, I stumbled into the central atrium once more, now filled entirely with red mist, faceless entities circling silently, their whispers a deafening roar in my mind. And I felt myself losing the last vestiges of individuality, my consciousness fragmenting, merging with the dark presence that dominated Blackamore, becoming another echo in its eternal nightmare. Yet still aware enough to scream silently in my mind as the entity exhaled, a soundless, oppressive satisfaction, claiming another soul to feed its endless hunger, ensuring that the horrors of Blackamore Sanitarium would persist, waiting for the next curious or foolish intruder. And in that moment, I understood that escape was impossible. The building did not merely trap bodies, it trapped essence. And as the faceless figures closed in, I became part of the ever-growing, eternally suffering collective, a whisper in the symphony of fear, an identity erased, absorbed into dark consciousness. And outside, the fog thickened, hiding the building from the world, preserving its secrets, its horrors, and its ability to trap the next unsuspecting victim. An eternal cycle of despair that could never end. Let's move to our 9th story. The night I entered Ashwood Asylum, the abandoned facility looming in the distance like a jagged scar against the black sky. I felt an immediate sense of dread, as though the building exhaled centuries of sorrow and madness in one silent, suffocating breath. And even before stepping inside, I noticed the windows were shattered unevenly, twisted reflections of the moon casting broken light across the overgrown weeds and cracked paths, the air damp with mist and decay, carrying faint echoes of screams that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. And as I crossed the threshold, the heavy doors groaned a warning, swinging closed behind me with a force that made the walls vibrate, and the interior was a labyrinth of peeling wallpaper, warped floors, and corridors that seemed to stretch far longer than architecture should allow, and I could hear faint whispers of names. Patients who had been lost here decades ago, each syllable a cold caress against the nape of my neck. And as I moved through the first hallway, I noticed the faint glow of red light seeping through cracks in the doors, casting grotesque shadows that danced independently of any physical source. And in the surgical wing, the instruments had been left in perfect disorder, trays lined with rusted tools, straps dangling as if someone had simply vanished mid-procedure. And yet, as I passed, the instruments began to float subtly, spinning slowly above the tables. And a chill ran down my spine as I realized the shadows of the missing patients were crawling along the walls, following me, observing, calculating, their presence almost sentient. And in the therapy rooms, journals lay scattered, pages filled with frantic handwriting detailing experiments on patient minds, cryptic symbols, and warnings to those who might enter, messages like "Do not look back," and "The walls have eyes" scrawled in trembling letters. And when I glanced at one of the mirrors, my own reflection was gone, replaced by a faceless figure mimicking my every movement with a delay, a grotesque echo of myself that made my stomach churn. And the further I ventured, the more the asylum seemed to warp around me, corridors bending impossibly, doors opening into spaces that should not exist, ceilings lowering and rising unpredictably. And I could hear footsteps behind me even when I was alone, growing louder and softer in impossible rhythm, and the whispers became words, names, dates, confessions, all directed at me personally, feeding my fear and panic. And I stumbled into the central atrium, a massive space flooded with shallow water, reflections rippling unnaturally to show faceless amalgamated figures moving beneath the surface, some reaching out as though trying to grasp my soul, and I felt their influence in my mind, probing, twisting memories, forcing me to relive my deepest fears, amplifying every insecurity until I was trembling, broken, utterly consumed by terror. And as I attempted to run, the corridors shifted, looping endlessly, every exit leading back to the same flooded atrium, the water now tinged red, the faint scent of iron filling my nostrils. And I could hear low chanting, patient voices forming a symphony of despair, blending with the hum of the building itself, which seemed alive, breathing, aware. And it was then I realized the true horror of Ashwood Asylum. It did not simply trap the body, it trapped the mind, feeding on fear, identity, and consciousness, converting intruders into faceless echoes to haunt the halls alongside the amalgamated patients. And in the surgical theater, the floating instruments now formed grotesque shapes, merging into figures, watching me, beckoning me to join them. And I felt myself being pulled toward them, a gravitational force beyond physics, dragging me into their midst, while the whispers repeated relentlessly, "You belong to us. You belong to us. You belong." And my panic reached a peak I could not articulate, every muscle frozen, every thought racing in terror. And as I was absorbed into the collective consciousness of Ashwood, I realized that this building existed, beyond time, beyond law, beyond escape, a living nightmare designed to consume any who dared intrude. And as the faceless amalgamated figures closed in, the red mist thickened, swallowing every sound but the pounding of my own heart, which now beat in unison with the dark entity that had claimed me. And outside, the fog rolled over the desolate grounds, hiding Ashwood from the world, waiting patiently for the next unwitting soul to stumble across its cursed threshold. And inside, I became another whisper, another faceless echo, trapped eternally in the endless horror that was Ashwood Asylum. My identity dissolved, a warning unheeded, an observer turned prisoner, destined to haunt the halls alongside every lost patient that had come before me. And in the suffocating darkness, I understood with absolute clarity that escape was impossible, survival an illusion, and the asylum's malevolent presence would continue to feed, grow, and torment forever hungry for the next victim, brave or foolish enough to enter. Let's move to our 10th story. The moment I stepped into the decrepit halls of Hawthorne Asylum, the heavy air pressed against my lungs, a thick fog of decay and mildew clinging to every surface, and even before my flashlight cut through the darkness, I felt the weight of centuries of suffering, as if the building itself exhaled the anguish of every patient who had ever walked its corridors, and the windows, shattered and grimy, reflected moonlight in fractured patterns, throwing jagged shadows across the warped floors and peeling wallpaper, while faint whispers seemed to emerge from the walls themselves, names, dates, and cries of those long gone, echoing through the halls in a low, omnipresent hum. And as I moved deeper, the asylum's architecture began to betray reality. Corridors twisting and stretching beyond comprehension. Doors opening into rooms that should not exist. Ceilings bending and sagging with a life of their own, and in the abandoned wards, rusted beds remained in disarray, restraints dangling, some swaying as if occupied by unseen entities, and in the corners, faceless figures crouched, observing, waiting, their presence almost tangible, feeding off my fear. And the surgical wing was worse, instruments rusted and scattered, yet levitating in midair, trays clattering without cause, straps tightening and loosening as if animated by some dark intelligence, and the walls themselves seemed to pulse, throbbing like a heartbeat, exuding a cold that penetrated my very bones, while whispers became voices, calling me by name, recounting my fears, probing my memories, amplifying every insecurity, twisting my perception, until I could no longer tell where I ended and the asylum began, and in the flooded atrium, shallow water reflected distorted, faceless amalgamated figures, moving beneath the surface, their arms reaching impossibly, pulling at my mind, compelling me to surrender to the building, and I stumbled into the central therapy hall, where journals lay scattered, pages filled with frenzied handwriting, cryptic symbols, and warnings that seemed to shift before my eyes, yet I was compelled to read, each word embedding terror into my psyche, and the red emergency lights flickered, casting grotesque shadows of crawling faceless patients along warped floors, and when I glanced at the mirrors, my reflection was replaced by an echo of myself, faceless and distorted, mimicking my movements with a sickening delay, and I realized Hawthorne Asylum did not merely haunt, it consumed. Every intruder became part of the building's consciousness, absorbed into the faceless collective of patient souls, whispers melding into an endless roar that echoed in my mind, stripping away my individuality, and I felt invisible hands gripping my shoulders, pulling me toward the amalgamated figures circling in the red-lit atrium, the fog thickening, suffocating, until my identity fractured and merged with the dark presence that governed Hawthorne, a sentient nightmare feeding on terror and despair. And outside, the fog concealed the asylum from the world, a predator lying in wait, patiently biding its time until another foolish soul wandered across its threshold, and inside I became yet another faceless echo, trapped eternally, a warning unheeded, a prisoner of an entity beyond comprehension. My consciousness folded into the infinite horror of Hawthorne Asylum, knowing with absolute certainty that escape was impossible, survival an illusion, and that the asylum's malevolent presence would continue to grow, devour, and torment, forever hungry for those who dared intrude. Let's move to our 11th story. From the moment I arrived at Duskville Sanitarium, an uneasy chill enveloped me. The crumbling facade, looming like a forgotten cathedral of despair against the moonless night. And as I crossed the overgrown courtyard, the cracked stones seemed to pulse beneath my feet, faint whispers carried by the wind, as though the building itself was alive, watching, judging. And I felt my heartbeat synchronize with the slow, menacing rhythm of the place, and as I entered, the heavy doors groaned shut behind me, echoing through the endless corridors, lined with peeling wallpaper and warped wooden panels, shadows crawling along walls independently of any light source. And every step I took, the air thickened, pressing against my lungs, carrying a smell of mold, rust, and decay, faint hints of blood from decades past. And as I explored the old wards, rusted beds and broken wheelchairs told tales of forgotten suffering, while faceless figures crouched in corners, observing silently, their presence more felt than seen. And I could hear the low hum of their collective consciousness, a subtle vibration that penetrated my thoughts, merging my fear with theirs, amplifying every memory of dread I had ever held. And in the surgical wing, instruments lay scattered, some levitating slightly, reflecting dim crimson light from shattered overhead lamps, while restraints moved on their own, tightening and loosening, rhythmically, as if performing an unseen horrific ritual, and the walls themselves seemed to breathe, pulsing with a heartbeat that was both mechanical and organic. And as I advanced deeper into Duskville, corridors began to bend impossibly, doors opening into rooms that defied spatial logic, ceilings stretching infinitely, floors collapsing into voids that seemed bottomless, and in the flooded central atrium, ankle-deep water mirrored dozens of faceless, amalgamated figures moving slowly beneath the surface, their forms fluid, yet corporeal, reaching for me with impossibly long arms. And every whisper became coherent, repeating my name, recounting fears I had never spoken aloud, forcing me to relive past traumas, twisting them into nightmarish visions that blurred the line between reality and hallucination. And I stumbled into the therapy rooms, journals scattered across the floor, pages filled with frantic handwriting, detailing experiments, cruel therapies, and disappearances, messages warning intruders like me to leave. Yet I was compelled to read, each word embedding terror deeper into my psyche, and mirrors throughout. The building reflected distorted versions of myself, faceless, limbs elongated, sometimes moving independently, mocking my every motion, and as the red emergency lights flickered, grotesque shadows of crawling figures stretched across walls and floors while the fog thickened, curling into humanoid shapes, whispering unintelligible threats, their voices forming a choir of despair that invaded my mind. And the more I tried to escape, the more the asylum shifted, corridors looping endlessly, hallways opening into infinite atriums, staircases descending into impossible darkness, and I realized Duskville was not just haunted, it was alive, a sentient predator that absorbed identity, converting intruders into faceless echoes to join the amalgamated collective. Their consciousnesses melded into the building's dark intelligence, and in the grand surgical theater, instruments now hovered in midair, forming grotesque humanoid shapes, shadows twisting unnaturally around them, beckoning me forward, while the whispers became a deafening roar, pressing directly into my mind, stripping me of individuality, reducing me to pure fear. And as the faceless figures closed in, the water in the atrium rippled with red mist, reaching higher, forming arms to pull me down, and I felt my body and mind being consumed, merging with the dark essence of Duskville. My screams silenced, identity dissolved, awareness only of the eternal horror that awaited the next intruder. And outside, the fog rolled thick and silent over the desolate grounds, hiding the asylum from the world, preserving its secret, its power, and its hunger for fear. An endless cycle of torment, in which I had become another faceless echo, trapped eternally within the corridors of Duskville Sanitarium, unable to leave, destined to haunt alongside every other lost soul, the building thriving on despair, the malevolent consciousness growing stronger with each victim. And in that suffocating darkness, I understood with chilling certainty that escape was impossible. Survival an illusion, and the asylum's presence would continue to spread its terror indefinitely, awaiting the next unfortunate soul, brave or foolish enough to cross its threshold. Let's move to our 12th story. The moment I approached Ravenshade Asylum, the building seemed less like a structure and more like a malignant presence. Looming atop the jagged cliffs, its silhouette jagged against a moonless sky, thick fog, rolling in from the sea, carrying a damp, briny chill that clung to my skin and settled in my lungs. And even before I entered, the air seemed to hum with unseen energy, a low vibration that pressed on my chest, warning me, yet drawing me in, promising truths that should remain hidden. And as I crossed the rusted gates, their hinges groaning like tortured souls, I could see the overgrown courtyard littered with cracked gravestones, broken wheelchairs, and remnants of gardens long abandoned. The shadows of twisted iron fences stretching across the weeds like skeletal hands, and the windows of Ravenshade, shattered and blackened, reflected nothing of the world outside, only dark emptiness, as though the building had already consumed all light. And as I stepped inside, the heavy doors slammed behind me, shaking the floors and walls, echoing down long, warped corridors that seemed to extend farther than any architecture should allow. And immediately, the smell of mold, rust, and decay assaulted me, mingled with a faint copper scent that hinted at old blood, the very air thick and viscous, making every breath an effort, while the silence was alive with whispers, barely audible, but incessant, names of lost patients, fragments of past conversations, cries, and maniacal laughter, all layered into a soundscape that set my nerves on fire. And as I navigated the first hallway, the floorboards creaked under my weight, warped and broken, sometimes giving way into black voids that seemed bottomless, while shadows stretched along the walls independently, slithering, detaching from any logical source, and the peeling wallpaper bore strange, almost ritualistic patterns, symbols etched into its surface by hands long decomposed, bleeding through time into the present. And in the surgical wing, the instruments were scattered, as if abandoned in haste. Yet some levitated slightly, spinning slowly, reflecting the dim crimson glow from broken lamps. Straps on gurneys, moving as if by unseen hands, and the room pulsed with a life of its own, the walls throbbing, the floor vibrating as though the building itself was breathing, hungry, sentient, aware of my presence. And in the pediatric ward, broken toys floated in ankle-deep water, some dolls turning their heads toward me, stitched mouths twitching, eyes glowing faintly red, shadows of faceless children slipping along the walls and disappearing, their whispers merging with mine, replaying my fears, amplifying each insecurity, each regret, making me question my sanity, while corridors twisted and warped, doors opening into impossible voids, staircases descending, endlessly or spiraling, impossibly upward, sometimes opening into atriums that stretched beyond comprehension, and mirrors throughout the asylum reflected not my own image, but faceless versions of myself, distorted, limbs unnaturally elongated, sometimes mimicking me with a sickening delay, mocking my every move. And as I progressed deeper, I realized Ravenshade did not merely haunt it, consumed, absorbing identity, memory, and consciousness, converting intruders into faceless amalgamated echoes that became part of the building's collective, their presence feeding its power. And every whisper became coherent, calling my name, recounting events of my past, twisting memories, forcing me to relive nightmares I thought long buried, until I could no longer separate self from the malevolent intelligence of the asylum. And in the flooded central atrium, shallow water reflected dozens of faceless figures moving beneath the surface, their arms stretching impossibly, reaching for me, while the red mist rising from the water seemed alive, curling into shapes that mirrored my deepest fears. And the walls pulsated rhythmically with a heartbeat that was mechanical yet organic, almost sentient, syncing with my own, every thump amplifying terror in my chest. And the abandoned library held patient files and journals scattered across the floor, ink forming faces and hands that reached out, whispering secrets, threats, and the inevitable doom awaiting me. And the chapel, though broken, resonated with faint chanting. Shadows of faceless figures kneeling in reverence or agony, their movements, impossible yet fluid, as if existing partially outside of time. And stairwells twisted into infinity, glowing handprints climbing along the walls, dragging me upward, downward, forward, backward, never allowing true escape, while rusted gurneys levitated slightly above the floors, instruments forming grotesque humanoid shapes, shadows stretching to cover the entirety of corridors, wrapping around me, pressing in on all sides. And the operating theaters became nightmarish landscapes, floors slick with stagnant water, reflections of my own face absent, replaced by faceless, amalgamated entities, whispering in unison, calling me, drawing me into the collective, the very air thick with menace. And as I attempted to flee, the asylum warped further, hallways looping endlessly, doors opening into atriums that reflected infinite versions of myself, each version screaming silently, trapped eternally, a faceless echo. And every attempt to turn back brought me face to face with the surgical instruments, spinning mid-air, forming shapes of patients long dead, shadows of faceless amalgamated figures reaching through walls, ceilings, and floors, their presence overwhelming, suffocating. bending my perception of reality, and the red emergency lights flickered, elongating shadows, creating hallucinations of faces in walls, floors, and ceilings, while whispers became deafening, a chorus of despair pressing against my mind, stripping away rational thought until I realized that Ravenshade was alive. A sentient predator, feeding on fear and identity, and outside, fog rolled across desolate cliffs, hiding the building from the world, preserving its hunger, its power, and its endless cycle of torment. While inside, I became one more faceless echo, another prisoner of Ravenshade, trapped eternally within corridors of warped reality. Unable to escape, consumed completely by the malignant presence, knowing with absolute certainty that the asylum would continue to grow, to feed, and to claim the next soul, brave or foolish enough to trespass its threshold. The horror everlasting, the nightmare infinite, and the red mist curling from the flooded atrium seemed to whisper with glee, as my consciousness dissolved entirely into the dark intelligence that had ruled Ravenshade for centuries. My screams silenced, my identity erased, leaving only terror, despair, and an eternal warning for anyone who might dare enter. A testament to the malevolent sentience of the asylum, patient, vigilant, insatiable, a nightmare that would never end.